A flight attendant tried to intimidate a black CEO, but he calmly triggered his company's legal team into action, leaving the entire crew stunned. He pushed the black CEO against the wall, thinking intimidation would work. He didn't realize the man he shoved had already activated his company's legal team. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always meets unstoppable accountability. The hiss of pressurized air escaped as the aircraft door cracked open for boarding. Dr. Kalen Merrick stepped forward with deliberate calm, the kind of stillness only cultivated by years of high-stakes negotiations and military-grade restraint. He was first in line, not by accident, but because Seat 1A was always intentional. His dark gray suit was sharp, nearly silent in movement, and on his wrist ticked a matte black watch synced to his legal comms unit. In his left hand, he carried a compact hardshell case, matte silver, encrypted, and sealed with biometric latches. It didn't look special. That was the point. As Kalen neared the entry threshold, he nodded respectfully at the boarding crew. "Morning," he said in a low, even tone. No smiles, but no friction either. Then, like a barrier snapping shut, a flight attendant stepped directly into his path. "Sir," the man said flatly, his voice already edged. His name tag read Darren Voss. He was broad-shouldered, in his mid-40s, with thinning blonde hair combed back too tightly and a clipboard tucked under his arm like a shield. His eyes, cold and appraising, locked onto Kalen's case. "That bag has to go under the seat or in overhead." Kalen didn't break stride, but he paused just short of the threshold. "It's been pre-cleared," he said calmly. "Classified hardware, federal exemption. I have documentation." But Darren didn't move. His stance tightened. "Doesn't matter what's in it. You're on this aircraft, you follow our policy. No exceptions." Kalen held his ground, unblinking. The two men stood inches apart, the case between them like a trigger waiting to be pulled. From somewhere behind the door, the cabin hissed again as another crew member adjusted air pressure. Outside, the rest of the passengers hadn't even begun boarding yet. The terminal remained oddly quiet, just a few gate announcements echoing in the distance. "I'm willing to show documentation," Kalen offered again. His voice was low, polite, but firm. "This case contains a compliance chip prototype scheduled for final briefing with the Haven Federal Board. Tampering with it voids its cert chain." Darren took a step closer, not to check the case, but to assert presence. His mouth curled, just slightly. "Doesn't matter who you are or what you're carrying," he snapped. "On my plane, you do what I say." Kalen's gaze didn't shift, not even slightly. "This is Meridian Flight 228. You're not the authority. Policy is." And then it happened. Darren, jaw tight, placed both palms against Kalen's chest and shoved. Not hard enough to throw him off balance, but with clear intent. Kalen's back struck the inner aircraft wall, just beside the emergency exit panel. The thud echoed louder than expected in the empty cabin. His encrypted case remained in his grip, unwavering. A slight ripple of breath caught in his chest as the impact hit bone and metal. Pain? Not yet, but the violation registered like a switch thrown. Behind them, a faint gasp slipped from a man who had just entered the aircraft. The soft sound of a boarding pass falling to the ground followed. No one else had seen. No one else had to. That single witness changed everything. Kalen stood upright slowly. His hands remained at his sides, open, empty, composed. He looked at Darren directly, no anger, no raised voice. Just a scalpel-cut stare and words spoken like precision steel. "You've just crossed a legal threshold," he said, his voice like stone cooled under pressure. His right hand lifted slightly. He tapped his watch twice. Click. A silent relay activated. The watch began transmitting live data to a secure channel at Virilon Technologies. The moment was now encrypted, archived, and mirrored across 3 secure servers. Every decibel, every breath, every misstep. Darren blinked but didn't speak. He didn't know. Not yet. Kalen stepped forward, brushing past him without touching, and walked to seat 1A. The cabin was still nearly empty. He sat down slowly, adjusted the case onto his lap, and unzipped a leather folder. Inside, credentials, ID verification, and a red tab marked immediate litigation triggers. From the cockpit, silence. No one emerged. No intervention. The crew either hadn't noticed or had chosen not to. As Kalen reviewed the paperwork with surgical calm, he did not look back. His breathing remained even. The shoulder throbbed slightly, but the pain didn't matter. The principle did. And the system he had helped design, compliance, verification, response protocol, was already moving faster than anyone realized. Outside, the boarding zone flickered to life as the next group was called. Inside the cabin, the tension had already taken flight. The moment felt less like procedure and more like a challenge. The shove came fast. Both of Darren Voss's palms slammed flat against Dr. Kalen Merrick's chest, sending him stumbling backward with a hard thud into the aircraft's interior paneling. His shoulder struck just inches from the emergency exit seam, the sound echoing with a dull, ominous crack against the narrow steel wall. It wasn't a nudge. It wasn't clumsy. It was deliberate, filled with an urgency that reeked of something deeper than misplaced authority. Kalen didn't fall. His back absorbed the impact and his feet held their ground. But his breath caught sharply in his throat as a ripple of tension snapped through the cabin like static before a storm. Behind him, the first boarding passenger, an older man with silver hair and a briefcase, stopped short at the top of the jet bridge. His eyes widened. Did he just? He muttered aloud, stunned. The cockpit door remained sealed. Kalen's right hand hovered briefly at his side, a lifetime of composure tightening every muscle in his body. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move toward Darren. He simply looked him in the eye, his jaw tightening, the corners of his mouth flat with quiet resolve. "You've just crossed a legal threshold," he said, voice as calm and steady as polished granite. Darren scoffed, puffing his chest in a performance clearly meant for dominance. But the tremor in his left hand betrayed something else, something Kalen noticed immediately. Without breaking eye contact, Kalen lifted his wrist and tapped his watch twice. A small blue indicator blinked to life just below the bezel. No one in the cabin knew what that meant. But for Kalen, it was the beginning of a digital trail. That watch wasn't a simple timepiece. It was connected via encrypted relay to Virilon Technologies' legal operations unit. The moment he tapped it, a secondary channel opened, initiating both live audio transmission and a backup video buffer from his front-facing watch cam. Everything from this point forward would be logged, time-stamped, and mirrored to a secure server. Darren, oblivious, stepped aside with a huff, muttering something unintelligible under his breath as Kalen smoothed the front of his jacket and walked forward. The jet bridge behind him remained silent except for the slow, cautious footsteps of passengers filing in, now wary of the space they were entering. Seat 1A awaited. Kalen slid into it without fanfare, placing his encrypted case on his lap and opening a navy blue folder marked in silver foil. Immediate litigation triggers. Across the aisle, a passenger gave him a questioning look. Kalen didn't acknowledge it. His mind had already switched tracks from passenger to strategist. His shoulder still throbbed from the impact. Beneath his composed exterior, he felt the stiffness setting in where bone had collided with metal. But there was no time to process that pain now. Everything was already in motion. He glanced briefly at the overhead bin where Darren had earlier demanded the case be stowed. It was still open, untouched. The irony bit deeper than any bruise. Kalen had donated to multiple aviation equity initiatives in the last decade. His own research on in-flight compliance had informed reforms that airlines now used as policy guidelines. And here he was, flagged, challenged, and shoved at the door by someone who hadn't even asked his name. Behind the curtain separating first class from the galley, muffled voices passed. Darren's was one of them, brisk, sharp, defensive. Kalen caught a few clipped phrases. He refused, showed attitude, some kind of tech exec. He knew what was coming next. Damage control. Spin. The premature justification of an unjustifiable act. His fingers moved deliberately, pulling a second document from the folder. A pre-drafted incident escalation matrix. Section 3.7 outlined immediate legal response protocols if a federal-cleared prototype carrier encountered obstruction or physical force while in transit. Darren hadn't just shoved a man. He'd interfered with the transport of government-linked classified technology that elevated the stakes beyond personal conflict. Outside the aircraft, sunlight streaked across the tarmac as more passengers boarded. Kalen remained still, posture tall, spine straight despite the throbbing ache. The man across from him shifted in his seat and gave a subtle nod, one that said, "I saw it." Kalen returned a glance. Nothing more. Words would come later when they mattered. His watch blinked again. Secure link stable. Recording active. Read the faint blue text along the edge of the screen. Kalen exhaled once, slow and measured. Darren reappeared 2 rows down, clearly unsettled now. He scanned the cabin, eyes briefly meeting Kalen's before darting away. The balance had shifted. He felt it, perhaps not consciously, but instinctively. There was something in Kalen's silence that unnerved him, a lack of fear, a presence too still to dismiss. The captain still hadn't emerged. Kalen noted the timing. No formale palegi. No check-in. Standard procedure if an altercation occurred on boarding had been skipped. Another procedural crack now logged. The passengers continued to settle. The overhead bins clicked shut. The aircraft began to hum. Kalen tapped his watch once more, marking the moment on the log. Crew initiated departure prep without addressing incident. He leaned back into his seat, the case still on his lap, thumb resting on its biometric latch. The folder remained open beside him. The wheels of accountability had begun to turn. No shouting, no spectacle. Just a man with evidence, strategy, and resolve. And Darren Voss, still unaware, had just become the first entry on a very long report. The plane hadn't left the tarmac, but the lawsuit had already taken flight. The delay was announced just as the last of the crew secured the cabin. 14 minutes attributed to a routine mechanical check. Kalen Merrick knew better. Delay codes were logged, time-stamped, and reviewed. Every extra minute the plane sat idle on the tarmac added another notch in the legal timeline he was quietly assembling. As Flight 228 remained motionless, Kalen sat in Seat 1A, upright and composed, reviewing a digital dossier on his secure tablet. His eyes weren't on the screen, though. They were tracking movement through peripheral calculation, particularly the flight attendant pacing the aisle like a simmering kettle. Darren Voss walked with the kind of practiced dominance that suggested control, but Kalen had already sensed the insecurity underneath. The kind that flared up when faced with someone who didn't flinch. Across the aisle in Seat 1C, a man leaned forward slightly. He was in his late 30s, dressed in business casual layers, face drawn with concern. "I saw it," he whispered. "I'll testify if needed." Kalen looked over slowly, eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity. He didn't smile, just nodded. Acknowledgement without invitation. "Thank you," he replied softly. His voice was calm, measured. He returned to his screen, minimizing the legal schema to reveal a file labeled litigation readiness, Class B violations, aviation conduct. But the real leverage lay beneath the screen, inside the carbon black case resting against his thigh. The prototype compliance chip, Project Bastion's most refined asset, had been pre-cleared for transport under federal authorization. Its inner sensor was calibrated to detect force, shock, electromagnetic tampering, even body heat beyond 30 seconds. One accidental drop and the federal certification timer would reset, triggering a cascade of delays. And Darren had already placed hands on him. The chip had logged it. As beverage service began, the cart rolled down the aisle with that familiar hush of squeaking wheels and soda can clinks. But it passed by Kalen's row without pause. Darren didn't even glance at him. It was deliberate. Kalen observed it with the kind of silent audit that stripped every move down to motive. There had been no service interruption. No turbulence. Only personal bias disguised as procedure. And Darren, perhaps emboldened by the closed cockpit, had assumed no one would notice. Kalen didn't move, didn't ask for water. He tapped once on the corner of his watch, not to record, but to flag the non-service gap in real time. The data would be triangulated with crew movement logs later. It was subtle, quiet accountability, legal chess, not emotional checkers. The tension shifted when Darren returned moments later, this time trailing behind another uniformed crew member. The man was younger, early 30s perhaps, with a nervous posture and a company-issued tablet clutched tightly in hand. He stopped beside Kalen's row and tried a polite but strained smile. "Good afternoon, sir. I'm Roland Dorr, the onboard supervisor. I just wanted to clarify the situation earlier. We had a bit of confusion regarding—" "My clearance is time-stamped," Kalen interrupted, not unkindly but without any hint of deference. "It's pre-verified, logged through Meridian's federal compliance system, and confirmed prior to boarding." Roland faltered slightly. Of course. I believe that's what we have here." He tapped at his tablet nervously, pulling up the manifest, then flipping to the security clearance logs. His eyes scanned, paused, then widened just slightly. Kalen watched him absorb the timestamp, the validation code, the routing confirmation from the Federal Aviation Compliance Office, and the encrypted origin of the cargo.
Roland swallowed.
His grip on the tablet adjusted like he suddenly felt its weight. "I see that now," Roland muttered, shifting uneasily. "I'll, log that for internal note. You may want to also log the physical contact that occurred prior to this review," Kalen added. "Impact registered at 7:16 Pacific. Within the boarding threshold. Within the aircraft cabin." His voice never wavered. Each word was like a quiet declaration, not a threat, but something that knew it didn't have to be loud to be final. Roland gave a small, shaky nod, and without another word, turned and left down the aisle. Darren, watching from behind a row, gave a smirk that quickly vanished when Kalen's eyes met his again. There was no gloating,
No intimidación.
only silent assertion, the kind that doesn't blink. Kalen returned to his seat, closed the tablet, and rested one hand on the black case, fingers drumming lightly as if syncing with an invisible timer. Everything he needed was in motion. Witness confirmation, service neglect, unauthorized contact, delayed acknowledgement, and now, supervisor hesitation. The ingredients were aligning, and Kalen wasn't rushing a single piece. His objective hadn't changed. Secure arrival. Activate accountability. But now the pressure was shifting, not on him but around him, as if the cabin itself understood that something irreversible had begun. The low murmur of the passengers returned. Trays opened. Windows tilted to let in the morning sky. But inside seat 1A, beneath the composed exterior and precise posture, a case had already begun to build. The weight of legal misstep had begun pressing down like cabin pressure at 30,000 feet. Midway through the flight, just as the cabin lights dimmed and the hum of altitude settled into a steady drone, Darren Voss brushed past seat 1A and drove his shoulder subtly, yet deliberately, into Kalen Merrick's. It was quick, controlled, calculated enough to blur the line between accident and message. The impact wasn't hard, but it wasn't soft either. It was the kind of contact that carried intent without overt violence. Kalen didn't flinch, but his eyes tracked Darren in silence as he continued down the aisle, whistling under his breath like nothing had happened. From row 3, a man in a navy blue jacket slowly stood, turned toward the aisle and said, "That wasn't an accident." His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the cabin quiet like a blade. Heads turned subtly. A few passengers exchanged glances. Darren's back stiffened, but he didn't turn around. Kalen didn't speak, didn't even nod. Instead, he tapped the side of his watch again. A soft tone vibrated under Kalen's cuff, just 3 notes, signaling that the audio relay had been activated. From that moment, every word, every footstep within 10 feet of seat 1A would be transmitted live to Virilon Technologies' legal server. The file was already naming itself based on flight metadata. He leaned back slightly, keeping his breathing steady. He knew the timeline mattered. Every second, every microaction now existed on record. The irony wasn't lost on him. Kalen was en route to a federal hearing on aviation compliance frameworks, systems he'd helped design to prevent profiling and misconduct like this. And now, here he was documenting a clear breach of that very code. The live hypocrisy of it echoed louder than the jet engines. He'd testified before about empathy-driven audit systems. Now he was the unwelcome subject of one. Minutes later, Roland Dorr, the shift supervisor, reappeared in the aisle, carrying a tablet with a flickering screen and a concerned expression. He crouched beside Kalen's seat, a forced calm in his tone. "Sir, I understand there's been some tension. Would you mind relocating to another seat, just until things cool down?" Kalen turned his head slowly, eyes meeting Roland's with measured precision. "No," he said clearly. "I'm remaining in 1A. Any removal without grounds will constitute escalation." His voice didn't rise above conversation volume, but it landed with the weight of something final. Passengers nearby tilted their heads ever so slightly, ears catching every word. Roland hesitated, glancing down at the tablet, unsure whether to persist. Kalen tapped his watch again, 3 short vibrations. The watch display on his wrist lit briefly, sending out a live pulse. Instantly, Virulon's legal AI was fed real-time seating data, correlated against known cabin angles and passenger IDs. The system began calculating who was within range of key interactions, highlighting potential eyewitnesses. From above, the situation now resembled a digital diagram of accountability. Roland, still crouched, tried to salvage the moment. "We're just trying to de-escalate before anything. I understand what you're trying to do," Kalen cut in, his tone remaining calm. "But asking the assaulted party to relocate while the aggressor remains unaddressed? That's not de-escalation. That's misplacement of responsibility." Roland opened his mouth, then closed it again. He rose slowly, backed away, and turned toward the galley. His steps were quick, not panicked, but flustered. Meanwhile, Darren had been standing near row 6, pretending to reorganize snack trays in the service cart. But sweat had started to bloom visibly at the edge of his collar. He glanced toward the front of the plane, realized Kalen was still watching him, and walked away quickly down the aisle, disappearing behind the curtain. Kalen finally exhaled, not in relief but in calculation. The incident was no longer a moment. It was a pattern, and patterns could be prosecuted. A flight attendant from the rear cabin, an older man with graying temples, passed by with narrowed eyes, clearly sensing tension in the air. He didn't stop, but his gaze lingered on Kalen for a beat longer than expected, then subtly shifted to the overhead cameras. He knew something was unfolding, something more than a seat dispute. Kalen leaned back in his seat and opened a small folio. Inside, tucked under a thin security strap, was a black card stamped with a gold seal, Bastion Compliance, Level Delta Prototype. He didn't touch it. He just looked at it for a long moment, then closed the folio again. The hum of the aircraft continued. Outside, clouds rolled beneath them like silent witnesses. Inside, silence returned, but it was no longer neutral. It buzzed with the awareness of escalation just barely restrained. The seatbelt sign blinked on as light turbulence passed. But the real tremor had already begun, invisible to the passengers, threaded through signals, documents, and digital records moving faster than the plane itself. Somewhere at Virulon HQ, a red flag had already been triggered. What started as a shove was now a sharp descent into corporate accountability. Kalen rose from seat 1A with quiet purpose, the hum of the aircraft's descent filling the background like an impending verdict. He moved without haste, every step controlled, deliberate, as if each motion had already been outlined in a legal memo. Passengers stirred slightly in their seats, some watching through the corner of their eyes, others pretending not to notice. But the tension in the cabin was unmistakable, like a charged wire stretched tight across the aisle. At the rear galley, Darren Voss stood hunched over the service cart, his back turned, rearranging cans and cups that didn't need rearranging. His movements were mechanical, overly rehearsed, the confidence from earlier now noticeably absent. When Kalen stopped just a few feet away, the sound of the wheels rolling beneath the aircraft was briefly overshadowed by silence. A few passengers near the back looked up, sensing a confrontation brewing. "You assaulted a federal-cleared carrier of classified technology," Kalen said clearly, his voice measured but piercing through the muted hum. "Every second of this flight is now under legal review. You may want to request counsel." Darren turned. His face, once smug and commanding, had drained of color. The forced smile he managed to lift barely held shape. His eyes flicked nervously from Kalen's face to the onlookers behind him. 2 passengers in row 5 had stopped mid-conversation, and one man from row 2 had turned his phone camera subtly toward the galley. The air had shifted. This wasn't just a passenger complaining. This was an indictment being delivered at cruising altitude. The purser, a stocky man named Reed Marvin, stepped into the narrow space with concern lining his features. "Gentlemen, perhaps this isn't the best place." Kalen cut him off without raising his tone. "This is not a discussion. It's a notification." He didn't even look at Reed. His eyes remained locked on Darren, who now looked less like a flight authority and more like a man realizing he had stepped into a legal trap far above his pay grade. Kalen turned and walked back toward the front of the aircraft. Each footstep felt heavier than the last, not from burden, but from purpose. He had made his point, and it echoed down the aisle like a sealed verdict. Darren didn't follow. He didn't speak. He simply stood still, as though movement might worsen the outcome. Back at seat 1A, Kalen sat down and retrieved his encrypted device. The screen lit with cascading updates. One message blinked persistently: "All counsel ready. Timestamp verified. Flight log captured. Statement draft prepared." The machine-like precision of his legal team was no accident. They had trained for contingencies exactly like this. And now the protocol was in motion. Roland Dorr, the supervisor who had failed twice to defuse the incident, appeared halfway down the aisle, tablet clutched in both hands. He looked flustered, cheeks flushed, eyes darting between Kalen and the cockpit. He whispered something into his earpiece, possibly the captain or internal operations, but whatever the intent, the timing was off. The descent had begun. The moment for quiet resolutions had passed. Kalen glanced toward the window, watching the earth begin to rise as the aircraft approached Haven City. The light outside had shifted from soft blue to amber streaks, like a calm before stormlight. Around him, whispers returned. Passengers murmured. Someone a few rows back pulled out their phone, likely trying to confirm who Kalen was. Information would spread fast. The statement he delivered in the galley had already been heard by enough witnesses to outpace any internal spin. A soft vibration from Kalen's watch brought another alert. Pre-suit notice filed. Meridian Executive Office timestamped at 15:47. The wheels of litigation had touched down long before the aircraft's tires would. The timing was more than poetic, it was strategic. Every procedural misstep, every unchecked abuse of authority, every skipped verification was now logged, compiled, and cross-referenced. Row 3's passenger, the one who had muttered about Darren's earlier shoulder check, leaned forward again. "He's going to regret this, isn't he?" he asked quietly. Kalen didn't respond, not with words. Instead, he powered down his device, folded his hands, and stared forward. His silence wasn't passive, it was pressure, the kind that mounts slowly, like cabin pressure at altitude, until it demands release. Moments later, as the landing gear extended, a subtle click echoed through the cabin. Someone near the rear had begun discreetly recording. It would be enough. The final thread was already unraveling. The captain's voice came on over the intercom, announcing final descent. Standard tone, neutral words. But beneath it, the mood in the aircraft was anything but standard. There was an awareness now, not of turbulence, but of consequence. Kalen didn't need to look at Darren again. He had already delivered the one sentence that mattered, and had done so under the controlled eye of passengers, counsel, and now the public record. The plane descended toward Haven, but the airline's credibility was already in free fall. The seatbelt sign blinked off with a chime, and almost immediately, Kalen felt the subtle buzz on his wrist. The coded message displayed silently. Team 2 positioned at gate 12.
No flerisc. No alertones.
Just precision. His fingers curled slightly as he absorbed the confirmation. It meant the next sequence was ready to unfold. Passengers around him rose with the usual blend of relief and impatience, rustling bags and pulling jackets from overhead bins. Kalen didn't move. He stayed seated in 1A, his encrypted case still balanced perfectly on his lap, his expression unreadable. His spine remained straight, posture composed, not because of pride, but because he had calculated every moment to this exact exit point. One misstep from the crew had triggered a cascade that would not stop here. Footsteps approached. Fast. Darren Voss's shadow stretched down the aisle before his figure arrived. A practiced smile already formed, though it quivered at the edges. He stopped just beside Kalen's seat, hands awkwardly tucked behind his back like a schoolboy rehearsing an apology. "Sir, I wanted to say sorry for the earlier confusion," Darren began, voice coated in forced politeness. "It wasn't meant to go that far." Kalen looked up. His eyes locked onto Darren's without hesitation. "That won't be sufficient," he said quietly, his voice firm but low. "Not anymore." There was a beat of silence, thick, humming with awareness. Darren's smile faltered as Kalen slowly stood, collected his case, and turned without another glance. The jet bridge door opened with a hiss, bright terminal light spilling in like a stage cue. Two men were waiting just beyond the aircraft threshold, both dressed in slate-gray suits, their expressions neutral, their presence unmistakable. Virulon's on-ground legal team. One of them stepped forward without hesitation and extended a thick envelope toward Darren. "You are hereby served," the lawyer said flatly. "Notice of pending civil action. Internal ethics review. You will be contacted through official channels within 48 hours. Passengers filing out began to slow, witnessing the moment with widening eyes. Darren instinctively stepped back, his hand only half-raising before stopping midair. The weight of the document seemed to radiate more than just paper. Behind Darren, Supervisor Roland Dorr jogged forward, tablet in hand, already catching the tail end of the exchange. His breath was short, his face tight with confusion. "What's happening?" Roland asked, but Kalen didn't stop walking. He turned slightly, just enough for his voice to be heard by both men and a handful of nearby passengers. "You shoved the wrong passenger. Now the story shoves back." He didn't wait for their response. The sentence hung in the air like a final verdict, heavier than any turbulence they had encountered in flight. The surrounding passengers didn't speak, but their sidelong glances, the cautious whispers beginning to ripple, said enough. Kalen passed through the jet bridge without raising his voice or looking over his shoulder. The flight was over, but the fallout had just begun. Inside the envelope, alongside the legal documents, was a time-stamped summary of Darren's behavior and a preliminary recommendation for Meridian's HR disciplinary board. Nothing emotional, just facts, cold, verifiable, and ready for court. In the distance, journalists began clustering near the exit glass wall. A leak had triggered media interest before the wheels even touched down. Virulon's attorneys had pre-cleared a private route for Kalen to avoid the press, but the moment had already passed into the realm of national attention. Back in the cabin, Darren's hands trembled slightly as he clutched the sealed document. Roland stared after Kalen, realization dawning slowly that their attempt at damage control had only amplified the damage. Kalen never broke stride. Sometimes, turbulence starts after landing. The moment Kalen Merrick stepped into the private lounge, the door clicked shut with a quiet finality that felt more like a vault ceiling than a welcome. He said nothing as he moved to the circular table in the center of the room, surrounded by glass walls and guarded silence. Two men in tailored gray suits stood waiting, Virulon's in-flight counsel and a digital forensic analyst. The second Kalen sat down, the room shifted from comfort to command center. On the table, a tablet blinked with the message. 3 passenger uploads received. Initiating sync. Footage began streaming simultaneously across 3 angled displays. The first showed the entrance of the plane, Kalen standing politely with his encrypted case, Darren stepping forward, the sharp shove, a clear physical impact against the interior paneling. The second clip was from midway down the cabin, capturing the moment Darren brushed Kalen's shoulder mid-flight, subtle but unmistakably deliberate. The third video, the most damning, had audio. It caught Roland Dorr stammering, attempting to redirect blame with a nervous smile. "Maybe we could move you to another seat, sir, just to de-escalate things." Kalen's eyes narrowed. "Pause that," he said. His voice was low, deliberate. The analyst tapped his screen. The footage froze on Roland's uneasy expression, half apology, half deflection. "That's the exact timestamp I spoke the line. Any removal without grounds will constitute escalation." Kalen leaned forward, tapping his watch against a receiver. "My audio log matches down to the decibel." The counsel beside him nodded, rapidly aligning the 3 clips on a shared timeline. "We've got clarity on sequencing. There's enough to demonstrate a behavioral pattern, not isolated misconduct." But what came next shifted the air. From the far corner, a 4th screen lit up. The analyst looked confused. "Sir, this one's unscheduled. Uploaded 10 minutes ago, row 9 passenger." Kalen turned slowly. "Who?" The screen filled with the image of a balding man in a navy jacket, seated silently during the flight. The video began with him discreetly recording the initial shove, then zooming in during the in-air jab, and finally focusing on Darren's clenched jaw and Roland's anxious glances. The analyst's voice trembled slightly. "That passenger was never identified during manifest review. He wasn't listed for random seating, nor on the marketing class manifest. But," he paused, tapping rapidly, then turned the screen. "He's a regulatory field auditor. Federal Aviation Behavioral Oversight Division. Codename Rook9. His current assignment: assess racial bias and profiling on select domestic flights flagged for complaints. Flight 228 was randomly selected last quarter." Kalen exhaled through his nose. He saw everything, and his upload came with credentials embedded in metadata, the analyst added. "He submitted his preliminary report 5 minutes ago. It's titled, Behavioral Deviation Observed, Level 3. That changed everything. What had begun as a personal ordeal had just crossed into federal review territory. Now the case wasn't just about assault, it was about precedent, audit failure, and systemic violation. We'll thread his footage into our primary sequence," Kalen said, rising from his seat. "Send the merged timeline to the executive legal desk and copy it to the board's integrity liaison. Mark it urgent." The counsel nodded but hesitated. "Sir, with respect, this may reach the FAA." Kalen turned, straightening his cuffs. "That's exactly where it belongs." He walked to the window, looking out at the tarmac where the sun had begun to sink into a bruised horizon. Behind him, the footage looped silently, a choreography of mistakes caught in real time. The counsel's phone buzzed. He glanced down. Media's catching wind. Early leaks just hit forums. Hashtags are forming. Hashtag Seat 1A incident is trending low, but rising. Kalen didn't flinch. Let them trend. In another terminal, Roland Dorr stood frozen as 2 other supervisors questioned him in hushed tones. He knew something had shifted. Knew it from the moment Kalen's calm reply echoed in his head. "This is not a discussion. It's a notification." Back in the lounge, Kalen reviewed the final timeline now rendered into a seamless split screen. He watched Darren's shove, Darren's smirk, Darren's jab.
Roland's déflexion.
And finally, the steady hand of the row 9 passenger catching it all, every movement, every misstep. Kalen finally sat again, staring at the screen. The story no longer belonged to whispers in first class or buried complaints. It was built on evidence now, footage, timestamps, metadata, and silence that spoke volumes. No one needed to yell. Not when the truth had already taken on a life of its own. The analyst whispered, "This isn't just going to internal review, is it?" Kalen shook his head slowly.
No.
"This is going to reshape how they define protocol." The counselor placed a thick binder on the table, labeled, Chain of Action Initiation, Flight 228. Kalen's eyes flicked to it, then to the still image of Darren's open hand, just before the shove. "They shoved the wrong person," he muttered. No one answered. They didn't need to. Outside the glass lounge, the evening airport buzzed like any other day. Boarding calls, baggage wheels, scattered footsteps. But inside, a case was being built not just to respond, but to rewire an industry. Because in the end, the facts didn't shout. They echoed. And as the final alignment of all 4 video feeds synced in perfect cadence, Kalen's voice replayed in one of the recordings, calm and cold as a legal gavel. You assaulted a federal-cleared carrier of classified technology. Every second of this flight is now under legal review. You may want to request counsel. And with that, it was no longer a warning. It was a reckoning. The assault was no longer just personal. It had become institutional. He smirked, confident in control, unaware that every witness, every camera, and every contract had already been leveraged to turn the tables. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always collapses when strategy and law unite, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The footage played in silence inside the private boardroom of Meridian Airlines executive wing. The room was soundproof, its tall glass walls now opaque, sealed off from the outer offices where mid-level managers hustled, unaware of the quiet storm brewing within. CEO Denrick Mullins sat rigid at the head of the long oval table, flanked by 2 senior legal advisors and a compliance officer who hadn't spoken in 15 minutes. On the screen before them, the scene replayed for the 3rd time, the shove. It was short, just 4 seconds of blurry security feed combined with stabilized footage from a passenger phone. But it was damning. Darren Voss's hands were clearly seen pushing Dr. Kalen Merrick backward into the aircraft wall near the emergency exit. The thud of impact wasn't heard, but it didn't need to be. Kalen's head snapped slightly from the force. His expression never changed. But the timestamp on the footage, blinking at the bottom corner, spoke volumes. The shove had occurred 6 minutes before official boarding began. Denrick sat motionless, fingers steepled under his chin. His eyes hadn't moved from the screen since the first replay. Why didn't they escalate this before takeoff? He asked finally, voice low and strained. His general counsel, Everett Darnan, cleared his throat and replied with slow discomfort. According to internal logs, Voss never filed an incident report. Supervisor Dorr assumed the situation was defused once Merrick complied and remained seated. Defused, Denrick repeated, as if the word had personally insulted him. He shoved a man pre-cleared to carry federal classified tech and left no report? The compliance officer, Nolan Red, adjusted his glasses. Sir, the records show crew ego. Voss acted out of irritation. Dorr tried to patch it quietly. And they both acted like they were off the record, Denrick muttered. But Merrick wasn't. Meanwhile, across the city, Kalen sat in a minimalist conference suite at the Haven District Business Center. Behind him, a whiteboard displayed a war map of tasks. Timestamps, audio logs, procedural violations, seat angles. 2 of his legal staff reviewed passenger footage frame by frame. One attorney, Idris Varn, pointed to a key detail in the clip from row 4. There. Pause. Rewind 2 seconds. See that flash near his wrist? He asked. Watch signal, said the other, nodding. That's the moment Kalen tapped it. It synced to our off-site data drop. We logged a burst transmission right then. Kalen reviewed everything calmly. The tamper protocol from the Bastion module? Yes. It triggered the moment Voss made contact with you. The casing's integrity field spiked, then settled once you receded. The internal log was intact. That spike, Kalen said, voice even but cool, is our legal bridge to damages. Not just bodily, but protocol disruption. The team nodded, and then the message arrived. Kalen's encrypted device lit up with a silent buzz. A private channel opened with a simple text from an unlisted number. But he knew who it was. One of Meridian's board members. Someone he had met before at a summit on digital infrastructure regulation. They want to settle quietly. We know what Darren's done before. You're not the first. Kalen read it once. Then again. He didn't speak. But everyone in the room felt the air shift. The tension condensed. The implications were no longer theoretical. There was a pattern. He stood, walked slowly to the window overlooking the Haven skyline, and pressed a hand gently against the glass. It was late afternoon. The clouds outside reflected against the buildings, tall and steel gray, like silent judges waiting for the next move. "So this wasn't an isolated incident," he said finally. "No, sir," Idris replied. "We've started combing through HR data leaks. There are whispers online, flagged complaints from years ago, minor settlements, all silenced. None escalated like this one." Kalen turned. "Because none of them had documentation. None of them had federal clearance. None of them had a compliance module with a built-in sensor stack." A quiet nod from Idris. Kalen's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in purpose. "Then we'll treat this not as a lawsuit, but as an audit." Back at Meridian's HQ, the legal team was unraveling. Counselors were whispering with urgency, typing on secured laptops, compiling reports not to prepare for court, but to prepare for containment. "What if he goes public?" one assistant asked. "He won't," Everett said grimly. "He'll do worse. He'll go procedural." They all knew the type, not the loud accuser seeking headlines. Kalen Merrick was the opposite. Quiet, strategic, deadly with documentation. The kind of man who didn't just want justice, he wanted the system restructured. A different advisor piped up, nervous. "What about the prototype? Could that affect his case?" Denrick turned his chair slowly. "What prototype?" Everett exhaled. "The Bastion module. Kalen was in transport custody of it. If the sensor logs show a tamper spike from that shove, then we're facing federal-level breach ramifications." Denrick didn't speak for a moment. "Then, what began as a shove?" he murmured, eyes growing colder. "Now points to a litigation event across departments." Everett opened his mouth to respond when his screen pinged with a new email from Kalen's team. Subject line, "Formal litigation packet. Virulon versus Meridian Airlines." Attached, a 28-page preliminary accusation document. Charges included physical assault, racial targeting, negligence of safety protocol, and interference with federal clearance operations. It wasn't just well-written. It was airtight. And then came the final blow. A second message, this time from a private compliance investigator. It was a forwarded conversation. Darren Voss had been internally flagged 6 times in the past 4 years. Each time, the complaint had been resolved in-house. One of them, buried under a crew retraining code, involved a passenger from 2 years ago, a black first-class traveler. Same gate, same crew leader, same refusal to log a report. The investigator's note at the bottom said it all. "You've got a pattern, and Merrick is about to tear it wide open." In his glass-walled office, Denrick Mullins sat alone now, the door closed behind his retreating staff. He stared at the footage again, the shove, the fall, the silence afterward, and the knowledge that this time they weren't dealing with a complaint. They were facing a blueprint for exposure. What began as a shove now pointed to a hidden pattern, and Kalen was prepared to expose every fracture. The clip exploded online before the clock struck noon. It began with a single post, a shaky but clear video showing Darren Voss pressing his hands into Dr. Kalen Merrick's chest and forcing him against the inner aircraft wall. There was no audio, just the faint thud of impact and the collective gasp of a nearby passenger. That sound, combined with the freeze frame of Kalen's controlled expression and Darren's aggressive posture, set the internet ablaze. Within hours, hashtags flooded every social platform. Hashtag Seat 1A incident, hashtag Shove the CEO, hashtag Project Altitude, and the most biting hashtag Power Doesn't Shout. Kalen sat quietly in Virulon's legal strategy room, the muted screen behind him cycling through headlines, his fingers interlaced on the table. Across from him, his lead counsel, Aren Voss, no relation to Darren, scanned the real-time legal dashboard. "You've already become the symbol. Now we decide what to do with it," Aren said. Kalen didn't blink. "We don't react," he replied. "We reform." Outside the glass-paneled meeting suite, reporters gathered like wolves circling an unknown quarry. Meridian Airlines had just issued its first official statement. "We are aware of an interaction aboard Flight 228 and are investigating. No names. Noith Mischin. Just a hollow echo in a world that already knew too much. But the public didn't wait for the airline to find its voice. The video had spoken for them. That same afternoon, Meridian's internal decision landed. Darren Voss was placed on unpaid leave pending investigation. Roland Dorr, the supervisor who had tried to de-escalate by asking Kalin to move seats, was quietly reassigned to ground operations in a mid-tier city. Yet, as these symbolic gestures rolled out, Kalin didn't flinch. His eyes were on something higher. He wasn't here for punishment. He was here for transformation. Project Altitude was born before sunset. In a secure server hub beneath Virulon's Haven office, engineers and legal architects worked in tandem. Kalin, seated before a wall of live data feeds, outlined the 3 pillars: mandatory wearable verification for all crew, real-time de-escalation logs accessible to third-party audits, and randomized behavioral reviews on select flights. If airlines can monitor turbulence, Kalin said to the room, they can monitor conduct. Every attendee, compliance engineers, risk analysts, privacy lawyers nodded. They understood this wasn't just about one flight or one push. It was a structural fault Kalin had chosen to expose with surgical precision. By nightfall, a private message arrived. A senator from the Aviation Oversight Committee had reached out discreetly. We've seen the footage. We'd like you to testify. Unofficial for now. Kalin read the message twice and closed his screen. He already knew what he would say. Meanwhile, leaks poured from Meridian's own archives. Internal memos, retrieved anonymously and verified by a neutral third-party investigator, revealed that Darren had been flagged at least 3 times for disruptive tendencies. In one case, he had been accused of aggressively confronting a passenger who asked for a second blanket. Another memo, more damning, stated that Darren had once refused to assist a wheelchair-bound passenger, citing crew fatigue. But each time, the incidents had been resolved internally. Translation: buried. What made the leak explosive was a single note in a redacted document. Staffing pressure means D. Voss must remain on rotation. Monitor more discreetly. The irony was bitter. Meridian had risked its reputation to avoid one more hire. Kalin's team had already anticipated this. They prepared a second wave of data. A public access dashboard showing not just Kalin's incident, but other passenger-submitted reports of misconduct from the same airline within the past year. Virulon didn't name names. They didn't have to. The numbers did the speaking. Across news networks, Kalin's composed expression from Seat 1A became iconic. Journalists compared it to historic stills of courtroom standoffs and silent protests. But this image came with a quote: "Power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it records, files, and proceeds." And just like that, the pressure turned. Meridian found itself not just under scrutiny but under siege. In legal chat rooms and policy forums, Kalin's quiet approach became case study material. His refusal to dramatize, his insistence on documentation, and his focus on systems rather than individuals flipped the industry's crisis playbook. Airlines scrambled to review their crew conduct protocols. 2 competitors, Arianesky and Vent Air, announced they were exploring similar reforms proactively. But not everyone was moved by morality. Some were moved by fear. In a boardroom lit by late-night fluorescence, Meridian's legal team reviewed the leaked memos and the rising storm. "He's not suing for damages," one executive muttered, voice tight with concern. "He's installing infrastructure," another replied, "and we're giving him the blueprint." Kalin didn't need to hear their panic. He had already calculated the response curve. This was never about vengeance. It was about exposure. From the beginning, every move had been deliberate. From tapping his watch to walking down the jet bridge flanked by attorneys, Kalin had choreographed a lesson. A quiet, calculated lesson in how systems fail and how they can be rebuilt. And still, the leaks continued. One, in particular, confirmed that Darren Voss had been retained on active roster after threatening a crew member who tried to file a complaint. That file had been digitally suppressed until now. As Kalin watched the new headline appear, "Airline kept known aggressor on staff, memos show," he leaned back in his chair, hands folded in thought. They had chosen the wrong man to shove. And now, every corner of the aviation industry was beginning to realize it. Kalin had not just pushed back. He had pushed the entire system to face itself. Kalin stood as the committee chair called his name, his steps deliberate as he approached the curved bench under the harsh light of the federal hearing room. The seal of the Aviation Oversight Committee loomed behind the panel, flanked by unmoving flags. The cameras were already rolling. A hush rippled across the room.
No introductions. No pleasantries.
Just the weight of what he carried digitally, legally, and symbolically. He wore the same slate gray suit he had worn in seat 1A, a quiet nod to the moment this all began. As he placed a slim folder on the testimony table, senators leaned forward, pens poised, eyes alert. The lead chair, Senator Halbridge, adjusted his glasses. "Dr. Merrick, you have the floor." Kalin didn't waste a breath. "What happened to me on Flight 228 was not unique," he began, voice steady and calm. "But it was recorded, time-stamped, verified, and backed by data. This is not about one man being shoved. It's about a pattern that allowed it to happen unchecked, and the system that expected silence." A subtle murmur passed through the press row. Kalin opened the folder. Inside were sequential stills, each marked with time, origin, and corroborating source. Behind him, Brandon Kell, seated 2 rows back, gave the smallest nod. His folded hands trembled slightly. 2 other male passengers sat beside him. And further back, the final and unexpected presence. The undercover auditor, now officially revealed, eyes fixed ahead with calm intensity. Kalin continued, tapping a small digital tablet that lit up a display screen above. "Here is the precise moment my shoulder hit the emergency panel after being shoved by flight attendant Darren Voss." He tapped again. "Here is the tamper alert logged by the compliance prototype I was carrying, which had been pre-cleared and federally protected." The senators leaned in. "And here," he said, now slowing his speech deliberately, "is the real risk." Another tap. The image shifted to show a log of internal airline memos that Kalin's team had acquired. Redacted but telling, they showed repeated behavioral flags for Darren. This was not an outlier. This was a risk Meridian chose not to act on. Senator Halbridge frowned. "You're saying the airline knew about his past conduct?" "Yes," Kalin said simply, "and they buried it under staffing shortage memos." Another senator raised a hand. "Dr. Merrick, are you seeking compensation?" "No," Kalin said without hesitation. "I'm seeking change." The room stilled. The clarity in his voice cut through any remaining doubt. He turned slightly in his chair and motioned toward the men behind him. 3 passengers from Flight 228 are present and prepared to testify. But more compelling is the testimony of an individual from row 9. He paused. The senators exchanged glances. Kalin stepped aside as the undercover auditor stood and walked forward. The cameras followed him as he approached the witness box. "My name is Daniel Keir," he said, placing one palm on the table. "I'm a contracted regulatory observer specializing in aviation bias and compliance. My assignment was to assess systemic response protocols to profiling triggers. What I observed on Flight 228 was textbook escalation by a crew member exhibiting bias behavior under stress." The weight of his words stunned the room. Even the senators sat back. No longer was this Kalin's word alone. It had federal verification. Kalin returned to the microphone. "This is why I am proposing mandatory flight crew accountability audits. Randomized, independent, not designed by the airline, verified by external oversight." He allowed the sentence to settle in the air. "I don't want this to happen to another passenger. Not because of how it felt, but because of what it revealed." Another senator whispered to his colleague, caught by a hot mic. He didn't ask for compensation. He asked for change. And Kalin, without flinching, lifted his eyes to the panel and closed with what would become the most quoted sentence from the hearing. In that moment, the room realized they weren't just speaking to a CEO. They were witnessing a reformer in action. The boardroom lights at Meridian Airlines headquarters flickered to full as the emergency session was called to order. The air inside the executive chamber felt tight, humid with tension. Denrick Mullen, the CEO, sat at the head of the long obsidian conference table, his expression carved from stone but his fingers tapping, an unconscious tell. Across from him, General Counsel Aren Drosk finished his statement without flourish. If Project Altitude garners institutional backing, Aren said, voice grave, we will be in breach of at least 7 oversight expectations by month's end. If we delay corrective compliance or are found negligent in past incident documentation, international routes, code-sharing privileges, and even pilot union negotiations could come under immediate review. The room stayed silent. Denrick leaned forward. What about the shove? The man they assaulted was carrying federal-cleared technology. Aren paused. We're beyond the shove. The case is now structural. Then, like clockwork, the blow fell. A tall, pale man in Meridian's HR division, Laron Strake, cleared his throat. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. There's something I need to disclose before this board goes any further. Denrick's head lifted slowly. We're in legal session. I know, Laron said. That's why I'm speaking now. He opened a file, physical, not digital, and slid it toward the center of the table. Inside were printed employee incident reports. 6 of them, all bearing Darren Voss's name. The oldest dated back nearly 2 years. The most recent, just 3 months ago. The boardroom collectively leaned in. That one, Laron said, pointing at the second folder, involved a black executive in first class. Darren used similar language, tried to enforce policy in a way that was aggressive, then claimed the passenger had refused to comply. And, Denrick asked, his voice now cold. And we resolved it internally. Conflict resolution file.
No formal reprimand.
The passenger accepted a voucher and the paper trail was sealed. Who sealed it? Another board member demanded. I did, Laron replied, his voice hollow. The room froze. Outside, in the hallway, someone coughed. It was the only sound that dared break the moment. When the news broke later that morning, it hit like a thunderclap. Meridian covered up pattern of abuse by crew. The headline wasn't just on a blog. It appeared across mainstream financial news, aviation safety channels, and international transport watchdog sites. By mid-morning, Kalen Merrick's name was trending again, but this time alongside whistleblower revelations and internal cover-up accusations. Public curiosity flipped to outrage. Yet Kalen remained publicly silent. Not a word. Not a statement, not a press release, and that silence, precise, deliberate, turned into a roar. On the evening of day 11, Virilon Technologies uploaded a 2-minute video to its official press portal and social feed. It spread with surgical speed. There was no music.
No narration. No dramatización.
Only a black screen fading into footage, Kalen being shoved at the aircraft door. Next, audio logs syncing with the precise moment of the shoulder jab during beverage service. Then, Roland Door's voice suggesting Kalen move seats. The sequence concluded with a brief clip of Kalen's composed testimony before the Aviation Oversight Committee, where his closing words hung like a verdict. This is not about a single man being shoved. It's about the pattern that allowed it to happen unchecked, and the system that expected silence. The video ended in silence, too. Just a white screen.
No logos.
Only timestamps and verification seals from third-party compliance labs. Within hours, the post crossed 1 million views. Within 12, 10 million. The damage control teams at Meridian couldn't respond fast enough. PR scripts were torn up. Interview requests were flooded. And worse, shareholder threads on private investor forums began to demand an independent audit, not just of the Darren Voss incident, but of all internal HR resolutions from the past 5 years. Back in his office, Denrick stared at the screen, replaying the 2-minute video for the 4th time. He didn't blink when Kalen spoke, but his jaw tightened when the final verification seal appeared. Independent Regulatory Auditor ID, M093, row 9. He turned to his chief legal officer. Why didn't anyone escalate this before takeoff? The man hesitated, then answered. Crew ego, procedural ignorance. And frankly, They didn't think anyone would challenge it. The screen glowed in the darkened room. Hashtag Seat 1A incident. Hashtag Project Altitude. Hashtag Shove the CEO. Denrick closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose. And at that moment, far away, in the quiet of his Virilon office, Kalen Merrick still hadn't spoken a word. But his silence worked like thunder. And with that, public opinion flipped from curiosity to fury. The moment the announcement hit public channels, Meridian Airlines has terminated flight attendant Darren Voss following review of passenger incident. The air shifted. It didn't bring satisfaction. Not for Kalen Merrick. The statement was mechanical, a clean sentence designed to calm markets and appease press. But justice, Kalen knew, wasn't just the removal of a symptom. It was the cure of the system that bred it. He sat in a high-rise office overlooking Haven City, the skyline muted by morning haze. Around him, the legal task force Virilon had assembled moved like clockwork. One tapped through timestamps. Another parsed metadata from the flight's internal logs. Two more reviewed clips from passengers that were now admissible after explicit consent. No drama.
No declarations.
Just precision. Kalen stood, facing a floor-to-ceiling window. His arms were folded behind his back, jaw set in silent calculation. The settlement from Meridian had arrived that morning. A multimillion-dollar offer bundled with a non-disclosure agreement and an apology letter co-signed by the airline's legal counsel and CEO Denrick Mullen. Kalen hadn't opened it. He simply slid the packet across the desk and said to his lead counsel, "I'm not interested in being paid for silence." The room went still. "I want to reroute it," Kalen continued, his voice low. "All of it, toward something that builds height, not hush." They understood. Within the next 3 hours, the blueprint for the Altitude Trust was drafted. Its purpose, to provide legal aid, surveillance review access, and traveler protection tools for high-risk, high-status passengers often presumed immune to mistreatment, but who, like Kalen, had learned that wealth did not shield dignity. His personal lawyers coordinated with Virilon's nonprofit arm. By sundown, a name, mission, and board formation plan were complete. No investors.
No vanity.
Just resolve. Across terminals and lounges, the media narrative evolved. Kalen's rejection of compensation was viewed as unprecedented. Analysts scrambled to understand the motive. The Altitude Trust website went live with a simple banner. "Silence is easy. Altitude is earned." Beneath it, a 1-minute video quietly unfolded. No music.
No slogans.
Just flight footage and a final line spoken by Kalen himself. "Removing one person does not remove the pattern." That sentence was now a national echo. In another part of the city, federal compliance officers who had been monitoring the aftermath of Flight 228 requested early access to Kalen's Bastion prototype. The tamper logs embedded in the compliance chip were now considered critical tools for investigating not just passenger assault cases, but broader systemic failures on board aircraft. A senior official from the Transportation Security Review Board made contact directly, requesting a closed-door demonstration. Meanwhile, 2 major airlines, Sterair and Northvantage, rushed to adopt the preliminary tenets of Project Altitude. They feared regulatory pressure but also sensed a public shift. Crew accountability logs, real-time behavior monitoring, and passenger protection protocols were no longer just proposals, they were becoming industry demands. Executives scrambled to reword their policies before Kalen's next interview aired. Inside Virilon, the tension didn't let up. Kalen remained at the center, not seeking limelight but making every second count. A quiet fire burned beneath his measured tone. During one late meeting, his project manager asked him softly, "What if they try to outmaneuver you? Rebrand, co-opt, soften the impact?" Kalen didn't hesitate. "Then we go higher." They built a ceiling. We build altitude. By the end of that week, training divisions within 3 federal transport agencies had requested permission to use passenger recordings from Flight 228 in their revised orientation modules. Calls went out to those passengers. Every one of them agreed. And through it all, Kalen stayed composed. Not triumphant. Not theatrical. Just steady. The same could not be said for Meridian. Internal teams scrambled to interpret the wave of attention. The apology had backfired. Instead of closing the matter, it amplified scrutiny. Why had this happened in the first place? What patterns had they ignored? What other employees like Darren Voss still moved unchecked beneath their radar? They issued a new memo, longer, more carefully worded. But it came too late. Momentum had already changed hands. As Kalin reviewed the final draft documents for the Altitude Trust's charter, he paused before signing. He looked out the window, recalling how it all began, with a shove against a wall and a refusal to be moved. He signed without fanfare. The CEO had not settled for justice. He had architected a future where justice was built in. He shoved the CEO and froze as the legal team stepped in instantly, ready to take action. If you believe true authority doesn't wait for retaliation, it enforces. Subscribe now because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of composure and strategic action in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and treating every passenger with dignity and respect.